This is Tommy's Outdoors 102. There is a lot of misunderstanding at times about what is animal welfare and what is humane animal treatment. And especially since the substantial portion of the listeners to this podcast are hunters and anglers, and I'm a hunter and angler myself, it's often we tend to throw around like, the most important thing is to humanely kill an animal, or we need to treat the animals humane, or animal welfare, or fish welfare. When we're practicing catch and release, fish welfare is the most important thing. But do we really understand what animal welfare is, what humane treatment is? And I think there's a lot of confusion around this subject. And I want to record an episode of the podcast where we deal with this for quite a long time. Today is that day. Our guest is Alick Simmons. Alick is a veterinarian, naturalist, photographer, and he's also a chair of the University's Federation for Animal Welfare, the International Animal Welfare Science Society. He's also chair for the Humane Slaughter Association, as well as trustee for Dorset Wildlife Trust. So it doesn't get any better than this. I had a great time talking with Alick, and I hope that in this podcast, or Alick actually, clarify a little what humane treatment is, what animal welfare is, and if after listening to this episode, you're still confused, you're still not fully sure, I hope that this episode at least give you some food for thought and some ideas and maybe an energy to dig a little bit deeper and find out more for yourself. So I think it's an important episode of the podcast, especially for those of you who deal with, who interact with wild animals. And while we're interacting with those wild animals, sometimes it's not that pleasant for those animals, but even if you're just a photographer, then these concerns also come to play. So that's an introduction for today. And as usual, before I let you enjoy this episode of the podcast, you know what to do. If you like the podcast, if you like what I do and you want to support me and the podcast, share that podcast with your friends and with all your buddies who think might be interested in the podcast or in the subjects that we talk about. And also, if you want to go an extra mile, leave the rating, leave the review, leave the comment, write a comment, leave the 5-star rating. I'll just give the good old thumbs up if you're watching this on YouTube. So, yes, folks, that's all for this introduction. And now, without any further ado, Alick Simmons, and we're going to talk about animal welfare and humane animal treatment. Alick, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks for your time.
That's all right. You're welcome. Thank you very much. It's an opportunity to talk, and I like to talk.
Yes. Listen. So before we go into more detailed and complicated discussion, what made you to dedicate such a huge portion of your career to animal welfare and humane treatment of the animals? Obviously, people who heard my introduction at the top of the show know about all the positions that you held. So obviously, this is very important for you. How did this start? Why?
Well, I'm clearly, since I left public service, which is about 5 years ago, I have done quite a bit more on animal welfare. But my career was based an awful lot on disease control and public health. So I spent a long time working on things like bovine TB and BSE, avian influenza, brucellosis, all sorts of diseases. I also spent quite a long time working on slaughterhouse and food hygiene. So those two things probably took up about 3/4 of my career. The other quarter I suppose, was animal welfare. And I did a lot of that. I managed to, I got the government to pay me to go to university in Edinburgh to do a degree in applied animal behavior in 1991. So when they offered that to me and said you can have your expenses paid and your salary paid for a year, you don't say no. So I went off and did that for a year, and that was really good, and that stimulated my interest. But I think all veterinarians take an interest in animal welfare, some probably more than others, but my job involves quite a bit of work on animal welfare, and I've always had an interest in it. It's just one of these things that I've taken a keen interest in, just because I feel that there's a responsibility that we have towards animals, which as a veterinarian you have a privilege in trying to promote. And responsibility, I believe, as well.
Gotcha. So let's jump right into deep end and start with like what is humane treatment? What does it mean, humane treatment, that we should treat animals humanely? Because I feel like this is a term that is, thrown around a little bit casually, and people don't really fully understand what that is. Not that I pretend that I understand, but this is on the show.
I think it's changed a lot over time, Tommy. Humane treatment of animals, perhaps in the middle of the 19th century, was not beating it with a stick, and not overworking them, not overriding them. And over time, what's happened is that we've understood the physiology, the behavior, and the needs of animals more. We've come to consider that humane treatment of animals is more than just not beating them. It's ensuring that the animal physical needs are met. So therefore it's comfortable if it's kept in captivity. It's properly fed and watered. The environment is right, and that it's free as far as practical from disease. And in addition to that, if possible, and increasingly I think it is, that the environment actually meets the animal's behavioral needs. Now, that's quite an interesting concept, because what's a behavioral need? And many people would say a behavioral need of an animal is simply to be able to eat, lie down comfortably, and breathe. But thinking has developed a lot over the last 50 years, and the behavioral needs of animals go beyond those simple things. And many animals, particularly carnivorous animals, they have a need to hunt, they have a need to forage. And you could argue that pigs in particular, being animals that root and forage for food and spend a lot of time looking, the needs of them, if they don't have an opportunity to forage, it spills over into distress, which is one of the reasons why things like the crates in which sows used to be kept, these crates, big long ones that would stop them from moving around but stop them from fighting each other, they also stop them from foraging. And that meant that these animals would be distressed, and you'd start to see the type of behavior you might see with a lion in a zoo, which would pace round and round. The pig, it would be manifest by its swaying from side to side in the crate or chewing the bars. And it was really a coping mechanism to cope with the very barren environment, the unstimulating environment. When animals like pigs, lions, cats, dogs, they've evolved to have a sort of repertoire of behavior, which, if it's not, it doesn't have an opportunity to express, the animal can become distressed. So that's it. That's the sort of humane treatment.
Okay, so
of animals in particular.
Yeah. So how to that picture comes killing animals, whether these are animals that are farm animals for food, or whether we talk about hunting, because obviously I'm coming from the hunter and angler perspective, and a lot of hunters goes like, oh, you humane kill, and it's gotta be quick humane kill, and it's like they're banging on it, which I have certain reservations, because I think they're not honest with quite often what's happening during the hunt, right? Like, I might always kill humane. It's like, well, maybe you try, but so how that comes into we hear humane kill, right?
Well, again, Tommy, that things have changed over time. If you think about the way in which animals would have been killed for food 100 years ago, or perhaps 150 years ago, the likelihood was that a steer or a bull, or a cow, which was being killed for meat, would probably be either been killed by cutting through the spinal cord at the back of the neck here, or having its throat cut whilst it was maybe chained to a wall or chained to the floor, and it would die slowly, because cutting through the spinal cord means the animal suffocates because the circulation still continues, and cutting through the throat means that the animal will die from the loss of blood pressure slowly, and therefore will remain conscious until blood pressure drops below a certain point. Over time, what happened is that people developed systems which were more humane and more safe for the people that were doing the work. So things like the poleaxe, which really wasn't a particularly good system, was ultimately replaced by things like a captured bolt pistol, which, as I'm sure you know, if you know anything about firearms, is a steel rod which is shot out of a pistol into the brain of the animal by holding it over its head. A blank charge punches that out, and then it is pulled back by spring action back into the barrel of the gun. That is an effective way, if it's accurate, it's well maintained, and use the right charge, of killing and stunning and ultimately killing a bovine. So that would be the humane way of killing cattle. There are a number of other ways in which you could do cattle. There's electrical stunning now, which is often used in Australia, New Zealand, one or two places in Britain. And then obviously there are different systems for pigs, sheep, poultry, and so forth. And all of those are specified in legislation. And as far as practicable, knowing what we know about the physiology of the animal, they are designed to be humane. So it renders an instantaneous, irreversible stun, or if it's electrical, sometimes reversible. And then the animal is hung up and killed by being bled out. Those are pretty effective systems. And in addition to that, there are systems for pigs and poultry using gas, various different mixtures of gas, carbon dioxide, argon, and so forth. And those kill the animals quickly as well. When it comes to shooting at wildlife, I think there are many ways in which that can be done, but primarily it's done with shooting, isn't it not? And in the hands of a skilled marksman, using the right equipment at the right distance and the right target. From what I understand, the killing of a deer, for example, if somebody complies with the sort of tenets of the deer stalking certificates and properly trained, you can get a pretty good kill. It won't die instantly because it's not been shot in the head. It's almost certainly been shot in the chest. But it dies pretty quickly if it's done well. But it does need to be done well, because if you shoot in another place, in the abdomen, for example, or in the leg, or in the jaw, then you'll maim the animal, and it will die slowly over sometimes days, particularly if you can't catch it. So that's a problem. When it comes to humane killing of other animals in the wild, I'm dubious about many of the other methods, frankly. Snares, which I accept are not designed to be lethal, but frequently are. A number of the types of traps that are used for killing wildlife, dubious about those. And I'm also dubious about the quality of shotgun shooting of some birds in particular. Having said that, there's not a lot of data about that. There's more data about the killing of deer than there is about shooting birds with shotguns.
Yeah. So you see, this is interesting because you said like, yeah, so humane killing of animal is definitely a thing. I'm taking that as, mainly it needs to be done quickly. And then there's probably like a sliding scale. What is quickly, right? Is 3 minutes quick enough? Is 30 seconds quick enough?
Well,
Right?
it's interesting, actually. If you look at some of the ways in which the traps that are used for killing fur-bearing animals, and there's only one animal that in this country is counted under the international standards for killing fur-bearing animals, is a stoat. In North America, there are a number of other ones like the fisher, the martin, and then of course across Asia there's things like sable, and then top of that there are things like coyotes and even wolves are harvested for fur.
I think that muskrat and beaver are big ones as well.
Yes, of course, those are two I'd forgotten about. You're quite right. Yeah, those traps there are designed to kill, unless they're using a leg hold trap, in a matter of less than a minute. And a number of the traps that have been approved for use for killing in Britain under old rules, which go back to the 50s, I think, designed to kill within 2 minutes. Now, 2 minutes is quite a long time, and that is possibly quite a long period to suffer. But then it has to be looked at in the context of what's being done and how it's being done, in the same way that, for example, there are many other ways in which other wild animals are killed where it might take days to die, using rodenticides, anticoagulant poisons and so forth. Rats might take days to die after they've ingested that. So, if you like, there's, as you say, the objective is to do it quickly, but it's not always possible, simply because either the technology doesn't allow it or the circumstances in which you're doing it doesn't allow it to be deployed. But the very best traps are very effective, but there aren't many of them. And I think a number of things like fen traps, not particularly effective. In fact, there's an argument that the international standard needs to be revised because it's not particularly good in itself.
Yeah. I even heard an argument like, when it comes to hunting, like if the goal would be to kill animal as quickly as possible, why we not hunt with grenade launchers, right? That will kill them instantly.
Well, I think one has to respect the environment in which you're doing the job. And I'm not naive about this. I've shot animals with a rifle and with a captive bolt pistol and a pistol, just an ordinary free bullet pistol. And I've been confident on a number of occasions that when I've shot the animal, it's dropped down stone dead. But I've been standing over it. I haven't shot them in the chest, and I wouldn't do that because, of course, there's no call for me to do that, no need for me doing that. But I think if you're shooting a deer at 50 meters or perhaps even longer, even with a high-powered rifle with a significant charge, even if you're accurate and you're getting it in that sweet spot in the chest, which is, 100 mil diameter, the animal is still going to take more than a minute, if not up to 5 minutes to die. It's not instantaneous by any means, but it's a lot better than many of the other methods that might be used for killing wild animals than shooting.
Yeah. It's also this argument, it's not argument, but you can take a long hard shot, which probably will cause the animal expire much quicker because you destroy the heart. But then you could make an argument, I'm going to take a double lung shot because I want to retain a heart. Right?
Oh, okay.
So I guess this also comes to play, and you can argue whether it's humane or is it inhumane, and is it humane to prolong the suffering of the animal in the name of you having a cut of meat or having a start.
I would argue not. I think the imperative, the first duty, if you're going to be shooting an animal for any reason, is to ensure that within the bounds of the method you're using, you are killing it as quickly as possible and as painlessly as possible.
Yeah, as quickly as possible while still retaining the heart.
Well,
I guess
I haven't said that.
I know. I'm just kidding. So listen. So far, it seems like you drawing pretty, straightforward. Well, not straightforward, but drawing a line. What's humane, what's inhumane, and you're setting a set of arguments. What's humane, what's unhumane. How that whole humane business links with ethics and with ethical. So, what's humane, what's ethical? Because ethical is more blurry, I guess. And, humane kill and ethical kill, there is an overlap, but they're not quite the same thing.
Well, you could argue that the way in which you define humane could be a set of scientific parameters. So you could say that a humane kill is something which renders an animal instantaneously unconscious. Or you could say its humane kill is that the animal is irreversibly unconscious within 2 minutes if you've, say, shot it with a rifle. But ethics is more about something which is less to do with figures. It's about attitudes, it's about standards, and it's about values. So you might say that, I'm thinking out loud here, that it would be, you could say that you would be able to kill an animal, but it would be unethical to do it because the likelihood was that you weren't able to get a humane kill. So in those circumstances, what you would be doing is overstepping a boundary which either would be recognized by the law or by an organization, for example, the Deer Society, or it might be overstepping the standard that you set yourself. Because you could have your own ethical standard, which might be different, might be tougher than the law, might be tougher than the organization which you're a member of. So it's your own set of standards, or one which you've signed up to, which have perhaps been negotiated and agreed, or perhaps set out in law. So, for example, with deer, there are certain things that you're allowed to do. There's no, for example, you can't use lighting at night to shoot deer. So that's the law. You're obliged to use a certain caliber rifle with a certain charge and a certain weight of bullet. And again, that's the law. But then you as a stalker would have your own set of rules, which either be set by the organization which you've joined if you are a member, or you would set your own ethical standard. And it might be that I don't, because of the concern that I have about being able to get a humane shot, I wouldn't shoot at a deer when there's more than a breeze, or when the light is poor, or when the animal isn't at right angles to me, those sorts of things. And that would be like an ethical standard, I think.
So if you shoot the deer, if you're going to shoot the deer with the lights at night, other than illegal, it's unethical.
Well, I would say,
but when you shoot the deer in not not in the wrong caliber, in a not big enough caliber, then it's not only unethical, it's also inhumane.
And illegal. Yeah.
And well, both of them are illegal. So obviously.
Yes, indeed.
I'm just trying to explore, like how much what is defined by humane is driven by ethics. It's driven by ethical, right? Because it has to be in some extent, because you can imagine people having set of ethical rules, which goes like, well, it's okay, they're animals, they're animals, they're for us here to do whatever we please with them. Therefore, humane standards will be different.
Well, I think that you're absolutely right about that. If you go back to the 17th century, the prevailing attitude there was that animals would respond to the stimulus of being poked with a stick or stabbed with a knife, but they didn't have feelings. It was a reflex action while they would run away from being poked with a stick or stabbed with a knife, but they didn't have feelings. And that was a philosophical view that spilled over into society, which essentially, if you like, sanctioned people beating horses with a stick, when they were being used as draft animals. But then attitudes changed, not necessarily the science, but attitudes changed. And society started to believe, as a part of the Enlightenment, that given what we knew about animals and, for example, what we understood about them having brains and nervous systems and a variety of other things like that, that perhaps they did feel, and therefore we ought not to treat them quite as badly. And then, of course, science started to catch up when people understood physiology of animals and so forth. And then they realized that actually the prevailing or the changing attitudes towards the way in which we treated animals had got a scientific basis to it as well.
Right. So in other words, science drives ethics, and then ethics drives what's defined by humane.
Yeah, and I think society drives what is acceptable. This is a bit of a change of subject, but if you think about the way in which we used to keep chickens up until about 15 or 20 years ago, they were kept, the vast majority of them, the ones that were kept for laying eggs, were kept in cages where the area that the animal was able to sit on, I'm just going to demonstrate this here, was smaller than that for its entire life. A4 sheet of paper, and it had no room to perch, nowhere to dust bathe, and nowhere to lay an egg. So it laid an egg on a bit of a wire mesh, and it rolled down, and somebody collected it later on. And that was its entire life. The science ultimately demonstrated that the birds were prepared to work, that is, do tasks in order to be able to get access to dust bathe, access to perches, and access to somewhere to lay an egg, and also to be able to flap the wings. They were prepared to press buttons in order to get to somewhere where they had that space or where they could lay an egg. And if you provided them with pressing buttons where they couldn't get that, they wouldn't press the button. So they were working for it with a beak, of course, nothing else. But the point I'm getting at was that what drove the scientists to do that work in the first place wasn't because some scientists woke up one day and said, I think we ought to do this work. It was because the public pressure was saying, I'm not uncomfortable with this. I don't like the way in which these birds are being kept.
It doesn't look right. I think without the science, I think that bird should move around.
So society drives, or sometimes drives, the development of the evidence base simply because they're uncomfortable with what they see. So I think it's quite important that we recognize that the way in which we treat animals is partly driven by the science, but it's also about what the public will accept. And sometimes that is ahead of the scientific evidence. Now, of course, what does happen sometimes is people say, we don't like what we see. The science investigates, and it doesn't back up people's views. But in the case of chickens, it did. An interesting one, that. So you can argue that the way in which we treat, the way in which we use snares, and that's a particular issue for me, because I think they're an abomination. I think it's a barbaric practice and probably ought to be outlawed. And I can see no good reason for doing it. And I would like to think that over time, the groundswell of opinion will be that this is an unacceptable thing to do in this country, and it ultimately ought to be prohibited. And my view is that if the people that want to do this really think it's a good idea, then let them come up with the evidence about the humaneness of it. Otherwise, we ought to just stop doing it.
Yeah. Or their ethical values don't see anything wrong with it. That's these other side of it. I don't see anything.
Well, that's right. And in essence, what you've got now is two groups of ethical standards sort of colliding.
Yeah. So listen, maybe now is a good moment to ask you that, and we discussed this question on, I think, 1 or 2 episodes of the podcast, but you are an expert here, not I. So I'm just only going to ask a question, like, what is the difference between animal welfare and animal rights?
Okay.
I just need to just not say anything. I just let you let you talk.
I don't think there is a hard and fast distinction. I think what animal welfare is essentially a codification, that is an articulation of what people need to do to meet their responsibilities towards animals. So if an animal welfare code or legislation says that the space allowance for this animal is X square meters, or the nutritional requirements of this animal is A, B, and C, or that you need to make sure that the temperature at which it's kept is 25 degrees centigrade, or whatever else, then that is meeting the animal welfare needs of the animal. And therefore, you've codified the responsibilities you have towards it, a duty of care. Animal rights is different, and that is essentially saying that in addition to the responsibilities that we have, if you keep an animal or you interact with it in any way, and of course it goes beyond farming, and it goes beyond shooting, and it goes beyond research animals, is that the individual animal has got rights which go beyond what you are obliged in law to provide. And that's where it gets quite complicated and quite muddy, because some people would argue that the animal has a right to life, or it might have a right to certain conditions in which it's kept. But then, of course, if you say that the animal has got rights to certain conditions in which it's kept, you're really essentially saying that's what the law says. Like I say, space allowance, temperature, food, or whatever else. So really the rights issue is more to do with the right to life and the right not to be injured or distressed or given, being exposed to painful stimuli. But I also think that, that's an animal welfare argument. So I think the distinction is often quite complex and quite contentious. I feel strongly that we need to do animal welfare better than we do, but I don't think that necessarily means that I'm an advocate of animal rights. And I feel very strongly that we have responsibilities. But I think those responsibilities sometimes are so strong that some people might say that you're essentially declaring animal rights. And I've had this debate with a number of people already. I think there are some people who think the two things are entirely separate. I think it's quite difficult to pull them apart.
Yeah, that's interesting because this I have the same view that it's very often seen as quite separate things, and I would even go as far as animal rights has a bad rap. And if someone is, they go, oh, you're animal rights, right? You're extremist, right? This is like, if someone is animal rights, he's an extremist, and everybody straight away see, the next thing the guy gonna say or gal gonna say is like, oh, go vegan, and do all these things.
And I do think though that philosophically, if you read somebody like Peter Singer, he would draw a distinction between animal rights and animal responsibilities. And certainly even that chap, what was his name, Roger Scruton, who wrote about animal rights, he would argue that animals don't have rights at all. All we've got is responsibilities towards them. I think I'm agnostic. I think we have got responsibilities, and one of the things I want to debate about is the way in which we artificially segregate animals into different groups, which means that the responsibilities we have to them are very different depending on what group they're in. And I think that's where there is a good argument for saying the responsibilities we've got to all animals are essentially the same. So therefore, the humane approach or the standards to which we care for them ought to be broadly similar, while recognizing the circumstances in which we interact with them are different. But let me give the example that I've used a number of times before in writing and in talks I've given, which is the rat, the brown rat, which is a very, very common animal. It's common as a pet, it's common as a laboratory animal, and it's quite common in the wild. And yet, even though we know almost certainly that each of those animals, a brown rat in a laboratory, in a home as a pet, or in the wild, its ability to feel pain, and you could argue about whether you think it can feel pain or not, but whether you think it can feel pain or not, you surely must argue that it's going to be the same whether it's in a laboratory, in a house, or in the wild. And yet we treat these animals very, very differently. So when in the wild, we use traps which are ineffective. We use poisons that take 5 days to die. And then in laboratory, they are protected to an extraordinary high degree by the conditions in which they're obliged to be kept. The people that look after them have got all sorts of qualifications. The people that do the procedures have to have even more qualifications, and they're subject to enormous amounts of scrutiny. Now, some of the procedures that happen to these animals are not very pleasant, but there's analgesia, there's a great deal of effort expended to make sure that these animals, whilst they have these unpleasant procedures, are protected from the nasty side of the pain and discomfort as far as practicable. And then you've got the pet rat. Most of them are obese. Most of them are. so you know,
that's animal welfare issue right there.
It is. So you've got this huge difference between the way in which we treat one species, and I want us to start thinking about what are the needs of the rat. And I think the need of the rat at firstly is not to be abused. So don't overfeed it if it's a pet. Make sure it's properly looked after as a research animal, and don't use inhumane, cruel poisons if it's in the wild. And there's a start, and yet somehow we seem to allow for all three of those. So it's it's getting that sort of discussion going that I'm keen to get. And it's not just about shooting, or it's not just about farm animals. It's about the whole thing about thinking about, well, we have got all these various different interactions and therefore all of these different responsibilities, and yet we go about them completely differently, and it's really not very good.
Yeah, and you touch on a very interesting point, which is, by the way, something I want to talk to you about as well, which is this like a gradation of the animals. Is like everybody keeps in the head a list of an animals, right?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then if it's furry and has eyelashes, it's great and we should protect it. And then you have these ugly animals and this and that, right? So even vegan slaps the mosquito, and then whether then people are less tend to get upset if someone catches a fish, but try to shoot a deer, right? I even wrote a blog post about when we were with my friend taking out fishing rods out of the boot of a car going fishing, and people were marching besides, like, oh guys, good luck, whatever, right? We take and said, I wonder what would be a reaction if we were taking out rifles.
Yeah.
Right? So, and I had many conversations about that as well, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. Is this really valid? I kind of feel like it is valid, but then as long as you try to argue and say, like, why this animal or not that animal, then quickly it becomes just absurd, right? What you do? Would you go as a brain mass? Do you say, what is the curvature of the brain? What is the percentage of the mass of the brain versus and there's an argument, like, anyone who's seen the brain of a dolphin next to a human brain, right? Said, like, there's no way we are smarter than this thing because its brain is just enormous. It's like, whoa, like, so
I think it's probably it's simultaneously more complicated and simpler than that, Tommy. And the reason why I think it's simpler is that we don't know, and that's the really important thing.
That's a good start.
We don't know, and the reason why we don't know is because understanding the experience of other animals, even other people, is very, very difficult and almost impossible. Let's just take the example of me falling down. Supposing I got up and fell over and broke my ankle whilst we're on this video. You probably would hear me squeal, and you'd see me limp, and you'd probably see me grimace, and you would almost certainly make the assumption that he's in a lot of pain. But you actually wouldn't know. You can't know because only I experience the pain. So take a dog. You might see a dog have a similar experience and break its leg, and it would howl and grimace and perhaps limp quite badly. And you would almost certainly make the assumption that animal was in pain. But you can't know. But a dog expresses pain, in my view, pretty similarly to where we do. There's a lot of drama, shall we say. But if you saw a sheep with a broken leg, you would almost certainly find it quite difficult if it was in a flock of sheep. First of all, to find it if it was a big flock, and you may have some difficulty in catching it, and it may not even make a noise. And I think there's a reason for that. I think it's because if a sheep draws attention to itself, it's going to get eaten by quickly. It would be singled out by a predator because, all right, sheep don't have many predators in this country, but let's take the example of an impala in Africa with a broken leg. it'll still be able to move quickly, and it probably would not make a lot of noise, because if it does that, a lion, a cheetah, a hyena is going to spot it quickly and pick it off. So some people would say, well, it's not showing any pain, therefore it's not feeling any pain. But I think you can't make that assumption either. So if you can make the assumption because the dog is similar to us in terms of having its nervous system and its anatomy and a brain not so dissimilar to ours, and therefore you say because the dog howls and it limps and grimaces, it's feeling pain, I think you can probably say the same thing about a sheep, or at least it would be very difficult to say it wasn't. So in a rather roundabout way, what I'm really saying is that in the absence of evidence that an animal doesn't feel pain, it's a good idea to assume that it does. So if you make that assumption, you're not going to make mistakes about how you would treat an animal. Now, I accept that a fish is different from a dog. I accept an octopus is different from a dog. But let's look at the fish first. The fish is a vertebrate. It has a brain, a spinal cord, and an array of nerves throughout its body, which have a number of functions, sensory functions, muscular functions to make muscles contract, but also it has fibers in its spinal cord, which are very similar to the ones that we have, which transport pain sensations to the brain, and therefore we feel it. Now, you could say that maybe the fish hasn't got the higher centers in its brain which allow it to process the signals that are coming, that telling it's had some injury, which we would perceive as pain. But then, why would you do that in the absence of evidence that it wasn't? So that's why I think, whilst you're right, it's important that we don't lump all animals together. But in the absence of evidence to say that an animal doesn't feel pain, and actually really difficult to get that, you've got to be pretty careful that probably you ought to be giving the benefit of the doubt. So it's difficult stuff, really difficult stuff, because society hasn't really taken an interest in the experience of fish for many years. And, you know, we've been comfortable when we see trawlers bringing in, I don't know, tens of thousands of mackerel at a time, and dumping them on the deck, and all the fish are flapping about. They're suffocating. They've gone through an enormous pressure change if they're deeper sea fish. And they've been piled up with all of their mates in a great big bag of fish, which is probably really rather painful, or at least you'd think it was. But actually, you wouldn't get terribly excited about that. I look at it and think, well, that's a lot of fish. That's about all I think. Mm-hmm. And yet, if you saw that with dogs, you'd be horrified, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
A big bag of dogs dropped onto a wooden floor.
I guess there's also these, you can make an argument that it depends. Like even two people feel pain differently, right?
So we believe people have got different thresholds to pay.
Right. And then you look at the alligator that loses its limbs and it's like, all right, no factor, just carries on. So like you said, it's difficult. There's no hard and fast rule. And this is where I said, like, once you start arguing about it, like the argument of a fish, like how do we know that just doesn't feel like a, discomfort that it cannot move rather than actual pain.
Yeah.
And like you said on the top of a show, it's impossible to know. Yeah. So I get that as long as we're operate within the boundaries of a law, mm-hmm. which is animal welfare, then it again boils down to ethics, personal values, that I will not let that fish flap around till it suffocates. I will dispatch it versus it's very individual then until it's a law.
If you look at the law that governs animal research, it covers all vertebrates, so from primates right the way down to fish, covers them all. And it also covers cephalopods, which are octopuses and squid, because of the evidence there that, even though I think it's contentious, that these animals are capable of feeling pain. So it covers all.
That's amazing.
But what's interesting about it is that there are other bits of the law that don't really cover the welfare of fish outside of laboratories. There's some, but it's nowhere near as comprehensive. So this goes back to my argument that if you're going to say we're going to protect this animal in this circumstance because we believe it can feel pain, then why would you not protect it not in another circumstance where it is potentially liable to start feeling pain there? And it becomes really difficult to do. Now, I have the privilege of chairing an animal welfare charity called the University's Federation for Animal Welfare, and it's twinned with another organization called the Humane Slaughter Association. And we've been putting money into research into better understanding the ways in which fish are caught at sea, and just starting to put a toe into the water into research into the welfare of mass caught fish. But also we're putting a lot of money into research into the killing of aquaculture, fish kept in aquaculture.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And which is, well, for many years it was done very badly. It seems to be getting done a wee bit better now. But those sorts of things are where the sort of boundaries are just starting to get pushed back, and the evidence is starting to build. And it doesn't mean, and I would emphasize, I hope a number of people are watching or ultimately watch this, I would emphasize that from my perspective, I have no agenda about stopping these things, just want to be done better. I mean, there's always a question that needs to be asked about certain things. Does it need to be done? And that's a separate question. Are these animals a pest? Do these animals need to be killed, et cetera, et cetera? But if that decision is taken, then it has to be done humanely. And the decision about that is about the balance of harm versus the benefits. And far too often, I think those discussions aren't taking place. And the more that we can get people to adopt an approach where when they are considering about how they're going to do it or whether they're going to do it, they have investigated best practice and finding out the best way to do this. And I think far too often, the argument is, well, let's get on with it. But I think there's more to be done. There's more.
I just wonder, is that argument based on, utility?
It is.
Right? So okay, this animal suffers in the process, but we're okay with that because we then gonna use it and so on, right? And that's an argument that you hear quite often. I think the biggest one is with angling in Germany, where it's still a lot of kind of interpretations, I feel like, out there, right? That you have to have a good reason to do this in terms of animal welfare, why you have to, if you're gonna consume the fish, or and the same goes with the hunting, if you're going to consume your deer, then it's fine. But if you're not going to consume your deer and you're, trophy hunting or whatever you want to call it, then it's bad. And, from the perspective of an animal, that actually doesn't make a difference, right?
No, I don't think it does. But then, that there's a long tradition of coarse fishing in this country where people catch a variety of different fish, and they've never any intention of eating those. Now they put them back alive, but
sometimes
it's a legitimate question to ask. Why, or is there another way you could do it, or do you need to do it at all? I'm not saying, and I would emphasize, I'm not singling out coarse fishing as being. I'm using that as an example, but I think there's discussions to be had, and certainly my view about deer stalking and deer, taking out deer. There are good reasons for killing deer. Most of them are not to do with harvesting them for food, even though that represents a substantial proportion of it. A lot of it is because of the genuine damage they do to crops and forestry. And without having some means of keeping the numbers down, then you will get this sustained, widespread damage. I would like to think, though, for the most part, that when people do shoot deer to protect woodland, then the carcass is used and eaten, because it's a waste otherwise.
Because why not?
But whether you're killing it for recreation, whether you're killing it for trophies, whether you're killing it for food, or whether you're killing it to protect crops, you have a moral duty to do that humanely. Doesn't matter why.
Yeah, I agree, and I like what you said, because I even I had this conversation, like, if you kill the animal for utility, right? There's a utilitarian element of it, all because I'm going to eat it or because I'm going to hang it on the wall, and then it goes into ethics of hunting, like why, is hunting for fun, quote unquote, good enough reason? And then you may argue like, yeah, it's a good enough reason. One last thing, we're gonna be wrapping this up. One last thing I want to ask your opinion about is this. We talk a lot about, we dedicated a whole show about humane killing and as quickly as possible and so on. Now, in nature, it doesn't exist, right?
No.
Nature is cruel, right? And I often said, like, we are part of nature.
Yes.
Right? We are part of nature. What are the good reasons to put a different standard on us than you put a standard on a wolf? And that's especially becomes interesting question. Let me just finish. Like, when we get into the topic of rewilding, let's say, right? You often hear that argument, like, oh, you so much, animal loving type, and yet you want to release the wolves that then we're gonna, not so humanely kill all the deer and so on. And so I find this interesting talking point. Wonder what's your view on this?
Well, I'm going to disagree with you about whether nature is cruel. I don't think nature is neither cruel or humane. It just is. There was a bit of film I saw on the internet a couple of days ago of a pack of African wild dogs catching an impala, and one of them was eating it before the other one had killed it. So it was being eaten alive. And that's pretty unpleasant to watch. But I don't think you can describe it as cruel or humane. Or inhumane. It just is. That's what happens. And I get the argument that if you're interested in rewilding and perhaps skeptical about the shooting of deer, then why would you be comfortable about wolves pulling down deer and perhaps eating them whilst they're still alive, or at least spending a few minutes suffocating it by grabbing it around the trachea, which is how they generally kill them. But I think the only way you can to rationalize this, and it is a rationalization, is to say that we are moral beings, and therefore, whilst we are part of nature, we have a brain and a set of standards which presumably have developed in that brain and mitigated and emphasized and refined by society, which sets standards for us. And if we don't set some standards for us, then I think the argument would be that we would have no reason to us going out and killing deer with our bare hands, or just running up and stabbing it with a knife if we could get away with it. But then society doesn't deem that acceptable. Society is, in Britain, has said, this is the Deer Act, this is the way you'll kill deer. And you're not obliged, you're not allowed to do it differently, the same way that we don't allow bow hunting because we believe it's cruel. Or we wouldn't allow people to go and kill a deer just with a knife or set dogs on it because we believe it's cruel. I accept that killing a deer with a pack of dogs isn't fundamentally different than killing a deer with a set of wolves, other than the fact that the dogs are under control of people. And therefore, we set ourselves standards. And that's what we do because we're a moral animal.
So it go back to ethical standards.
Well, I think it does. Yes.
It's because I was already, getting ready to get an argument like, but we have a brain that has these standards. That's kind of the same argument, like, all the other mammals, wolves, sheep, and all, they also have a brain and all that. So should they, like, why we not holding them up to the standards?
Well, who knows? I mean, you might find out before too long that sheep have ethical standards. I doubt it, but I keep an open mind about these things.
Yeah, it was this guy. He wrote this article. McMahon, I think, was his name. Yeah. He was arguing that we should shot the carnivores because they're causing pain. You familiar with that guy?
Well, I did read a paper, and I can't remember the name of the chap who wrote it, but it was about
McMahon, I think is his name. I don't remember his first name.
He was arguing that if you can't turn carnivores herbivorous, then we should humanely kill them because of the cruel way in which they kill herbivores, failing to understand that it's not that you have to train a carnivore to eat grass. It's physiologically incapable of being able to digest it, even if it could swallow it. But he was a philosopher, not an anatomist, a veterinarian, or a biologist. So I think we gave him the benefit of the doubt and said, well, that's interesting, but ignored it. Yeah, that's a separate conversation. Alick, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. It was very educational. And do you have any final words of wisdom for our listeners and viewers? No, I think the only thing I would say is this has been an interesting discussion, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you again, Tommy. And just your readers, your listeners, I should say, keep an open mind about this sort of thing, and keep the dialogue going, because these things are not going to get solved if we end up arguing. We need to debate, and we need to debate rationally, recognizing that not everything is about science. Some of it is about ethics. Absolutely. It seems like a lot of that is about ethics. Alick, thank you very much. Appreciate it. You're welcome.